What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Queer Collective Podcast. My name is Karbon.
And I'm Emily, and today we're here to serve you some Queer Collective election coverage, baby.
Yes, queers for politics.
Heck yeah.
Or queers in politics.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
Okay, so
exactly.
We're here to talk about the federal election going on right now. You may or may not heard of it. Yes, you have. If you live in Canada, that is.
So today we have a lot of facts for you. We're going to be talking about the party's platforms. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be reading a little bit off of our pages, off of our screens, just so we make sure we're giving you the right information. Yeah. There is going to be a little bit of opinion mixed in there. We'll sort of like flag that. My objective here isn't to persuade anyone to vote the way I'm voting. It's just to give you the information, tell you how I'm feeling a little bit, because that's what this podcast is typically about. Mm-hmm. We talk our feelings.
Yeah. And specifically for today, our main focus is going to be on specifically LGBTQ2S plus issues pertaining to how each party is addressing LGBT issues.
Yeah,
but we
also
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, Z, Y, L, M, N, O, P. issues.
Yeah. And that is going to include as well, for me, is healthcare and mental health, because I think healthcare is a queer issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an everybody issue, but on average, the stakes are higher when you're queer.
Totally.
On top of that, because it is incredibly important for us, we are also going to be talking about climate issues and Indigenous rights issues. So let's get into it.
I'm not really interested in talking about the Conservative Party throughout this entire podcast, so I'm just going to lay it all out for you here, why I don't want to talk about them.
So some heavy, pretty strong anti-conservative opinions here coming from this side of the room.
I guess that's an opinion right out of the gate.
Yeah, wow. But very bold and strong.
I have facts to back it up.
Okay,
so
please hit us with it.
This isn't just opinion. Okay, so I titled this, Why We Don't Fuck with the Conservative Party. I'll beep it out because Laura doesn't like when I swear. So Erin O'Toole, the Conservative leader, has paid a lot of lip service to the queer community.
I'm a pro-choice ally to the LGBTQ community.
Pause. What is lip service?
Basically, he's just saying he's like a LGBTQ ally.
Kind of like all talk, lip service?
All talk. Like he's just trying to make people feel not scared to vote for him. The thing is with the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party is people don't want to vote for the Conservative Party when they get too socially conservative, and that's predominantly like liberal middle voters. So
I see.
That's what happened last time with, I can't even remember his name, Andrew Scheer. So anyway, so he's like claiming to be a queer ally, although his party members and his platform continues to contradict this and pander to the far-right social conservatives, because that is a big chunk of the conservative voter base. So all three major parties, that being the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, and the NDPs, promised to ban conversion therapy, although the conservative platform only includes attempts to forcibly change a person's sexual orientation. So notably, that excludes gender identity and expression.
Yeah.
So
that's absolutely insane that it still exists. Conversion therapy.
It is.
You're just like basically brainwashing you enough until you no longer believe you're you.
Yeah.
That's what that is.
Yeah. According to statistics, 10% of the queer community has been subjected to conversion therapy.
Which is incredibly sad.
So obviously this is transphobic. The fact that he's the only party who's saying that he's not going to include gender expression here. I would say like the biggest issue here in Canada is transphobia. Honestly, that makes up the largest proportion of like queer deaths.
Do you mean
murders.
Pertaining to LGBT issues?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, not like overall in all of Canada as the biggest issue.
No, that's not the biggest. Well, I don't know.
Well, the thing is that it's really difficult to rank where an issue is.
It depends to each specific person. And that's why I'm not telling you what to vote for, because it like your vote is really a personal decision, because it depends on what is most important to you. Yeah. So what's notable here is that nearly half of Erin O'Toole's caucus voted against banning conversion therapy when it was first introduced into Parliament.
Wow.
So the truth is in the tea leaves, baby.
The tea leaves.
Yeah.
What is that? Is that an expression?
I think so.
Okay.
The next major point I want to make is that the Conservatives have made upholding conscious rights for healthcare workers a commitment. So
what does that mean, conscious rights?
Conscious rights entails allowing healthcare providers like doctors and nurses to refuse to perform certain healthcare services on religious or moral grounds. So while conscious rights don't allow medical professionals to refuse treatment just for being queer, they can refuse gender affirming care, making already difficult to access medical care even more inaccessible. So clearly, even just like on my second point here, their whole platform is very transphobic.
Don't like that.
No, I don't like it at all. The last point I want to make of why I'm anti-conservative and just like don't even want to look at them is just like their stance on sex workers, right? Predominantly like Aaron O'Toole, his whole career has been very anti-sex work.
I'm the MP for Durham, but I'm also a father, a proud father of an 8-year-old girl who is the apple of my eye. I cannot stand in this House and say that there's any public good in creating and promoting a legalized sex trade, Mr. Speaker. I think, in fact, it's abhorrent to suggest to our young women that this should be an industry that is considered, Mr. Speaker.
If you look into the background of sex work, and I will also like include some resources down below because it's a huge issue to get into right now, but the conservatives have been major people who have been battling sex workers in court and have just like continually reintroduced anti-sex work legislation that puts them in danger. So that's all I want to say there. That could be honestly an entire podcast, and I'm down to do that, where we can like really dive into that because it does deserve its own podcast.
Yeah, so let us know if you're interested in that.
Yeah, so that's all I'm going to say on the Conservative Party for today. Yeah. The main reason that I don't like engaging with the Conservative Party, obviously, is because of the social issues that I had just listed. And that is a personal choice. You may feel differently. You can chat it up in the comments. I'm happy to hear from people. But one topic that I will bring them back up in is in climate policy, because I think it is a really important issue. They are claiming to have a robust climate policy. So we're going to get into fact checking theirs, the Liberal parties, and the NDP parties.
Yeah. Now, the reason also, because there are more parties than just Liberal, NDP, and Conservative. However, those are the three major parties that we're going to be talking about. The reason for that is because, for example, the Green Party is very small. It's not really going to get very many votes. I believe that the reason for that is because of how disorganized they are, how vague they are with their policies and with their platform, and how much division that currently exists within the Green Party itself.
Yeah, so I can also link to a podcast episode, I think it's the CBC Front Burner, where they talk about all of the division that's happening within the Green Party. But since they transferred leadership from Elizabeth May, there has been a lot of division in the party. There's claims that it's based in racism. It's like there's a lot going on there that I don't feel like we can properly cover right now. So if you're interested, it will be in the show notes.
Yeah, so a link to another podcast, CBC Front Burner, just so that you can get more intel on the Green Party.
On the kind of topic of queer issues, I do want to cover the Liberal and the NDP's stance on queer issues, like their sort of main stance. Obviously, each party is talking about banning conversion therapy. And one thing that is notable is that the Conservative Party, which I'm not sure if they would follow through on this, and the NDP party are talking about ending the blood ban for gay men and bisexual men.
Oh, man. Similar to conversion therapy, I can't believe that the blood ban is still a thing. The fact that gay men specifically cannot donate blood just because they're gay, regardless of not having any illnesses, not having any sort of things that you can contract and pass on through the blood, regardless of that, they still can't donate blood. That is just such blatant discrimination, and it's so disgusting.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that is obviously fallout from the 80s HIV crisis. Which,
the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah, which we talked about a bit in our podcast about gay marriage, which I think is going to be coming out next week. So you can kind of keep an eye out for that, because the AIDS epidemic is very much intertwined with gay marriage.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we can honestly do another podcast as well. Just talking about all of these issues is giving me a lot of ideas for podcasts I want to do in the future. I would love to talk about the blood ban in general. So yeah.
Let us know in the comments what you like from this podcast, what issues speak to you, and what you would like to hear more about, and we can make that happen.
Yeah, your feedback is honestly really helpful, and we love to hear from you. So the one notable thing is the Liberal Party did not include ending the blood ban in their campaign this time, which is strange because in their last two platforms they did include it and they were unsuccessful in ending the blood ban. So that's one notable thing. So the next thing that I want to jump into is queer health issues. So I would say that the NDP's commitment to queer health remains the strongest among the parties. They promise to work with provinces and territories to make trans and gender affirming healthcare free and accessible. This eliminates systemic barriers and quote unquote, provide funding to support the creation and expansion of shelters for trans youth. So this is something that activists have long been organizing around. The NDP also commits to adding sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression to the Employment Equity Act to help mitigate the discrimination queer people often face in finding work. Mm-hmm. So to stop and chat about this, I think this is really important and addresses trans rights and trans issues. Trans people are predominantly impacted the most when it comes to employment.
Yes.
It is very, very challenging.
And healthcare.
Yes. It is very challenging still to this day for trans folks to find employment.
Yeah.
And including that in the Employment Equity Act, I would say is extremely important.
Yeah.
So I am really interested in what the NDP has to offer here in terms of queer issues. I am listening right now to The Village Season 2. It's a CBC podcast. It's really great if anyone is interested, but they're talking about trans deaths in Toronto. And there's a lot of really predominant trans activists and trans sex workers who appear in this series. And a lot of them do talk about how big of a challenge it is for them to find work. And that's why a lot of trans people end up working in the sex trade. So there was one person on there, I'll include their name. I don't have it right now off the top of my head, but they previously worked in healthcare, had a great job, was doing great, had no like prior complaints from their employer. Mm-hmm. And then they started their transition and they were like abruptly fired. So they tried to find other jobs, couldn't find anything, and then they ended up in sex work. So that is just one example of this broader systemic issue. So I'm really glad that the NDP party is addressing this. I think that's really important. I also think that gender affirming surgery in healthcare is also a huge issue, and I'm glad that they're addressing it.
Okay.
Next up, I want to kind of chat about the Liberal Party. So this election, the Liberals have also added financially supporting queer couples trying to have children through expensive medical procedures such as IVF. So this is a new and I would say positive commitment, certainly, but the Liberals continue to offer, I would say, too narrow of a scope of policies for queer people.
What do you mean by that?
I'm just a bit disappointed that they don't have anything around trans issues per se.
Okay.
I don't know. I find it a little bit disappointing. I do think that adoption is an option for queer folks. I do think that, I don't necessarily think that IVF is an issue that trumps what the NDP party is offering.
I think it's great that they would offer that for free. I think that's fantastic. But I don't think it covers everything. Yeah. That's just one option. Like you mentioned, adoption is another option. So when it comes to that, it's like, yes, IVF is definitely a good thing in terms of offering it for free. But there are other avenues that also need to be addressed.
Yeah.
So it's like my stance on that, or my opinion rather, is somewhat neutral of like, wow, that's amazing. But also there's other things, you know, that need to be addressed and that can also help us push forward.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like an incomplete sentence to me, where I'm kind of just waiting for them to finish. Yeah, I'm waiting for more.
Yeah, I'd say there's some fat gaps in that platform. One thing I will say is their platform being fairly trans exclusionary does show that, and this is a bit of an opinion and like my sort of like political pundit kind of take here, it shows that they are pandering to, I would say, middle to upper class gay and lesbian couples.
Oh, I see. Your opinion to me makes sense because middle/rich gay and lesbian couples just don't face nearly, and we talked about this in our next week's podcast, which is all about gay marriage. They just don't deal systemically with nearly as many issues as trans people do, as queer people of color do, as like people that are living in poverty that are queer do, you know, like there's so many layers when it comes to just being queer in general. Like you can be queer in this, queer in that. So kind of catering to like the rich, white, cis, you know, maybe straight passing people. Even I guess I get it. They're trying to like. It's
strategic. It's
very strategic,
but also kind of disappointing.
It's extremely disappointing because it's not a symbol or a show of everybody matters. It's a show of people with money matter. And it's kind of furthering that dialect.
Yeah,
right,
people who I think I can get their vote matter because I would say that typically queer people who do care about like the intersectional issues in our community would predominantly vote farther left and farther on socialist issues. So.
On average,
yeah. So that is sort of sadly everything that is there on predominant, like specifically queer issues. But one thing that I do really want to flag is that I said earlier on in the podcast that I believe that mental health is a queer issue. It's obviously an everyone issue, but it is predominantly a queer issue because queer people are more affected by mental health issues.
Yeah, throughout the entire queer community, you know, people who come out to their friends or their family, maybe they get rejected. They face rejection as a human being. Like, I don't accept you as a human being. That's extremely harsh for anyone.
Yeah.
So of course, on average, the suicide rates are going to be higher in the queer community than it is going to be in, like, say, the average person in society.
100%.
So I truly, fully agree with you there of, like, mental health issues are very much predominantly queer issues. So on mental health, I am basically going to summarize what I learned in terms of what the parties plan to do for mental health. So the Liberals, and I'm reading this now, the Liberals would establish a new mental health funding transfer to provinces and territories to expand the delivery of free mental health services with an initial investment of $4.5 billion over 5 years.
Okay.
So the fact that they're giving us numbers, I like that.
Yeah.
I don't want you to be like, we're going to expand it and then not give us specifics.
Yeah. And I will say before they called the snap election, they did, their finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, she did release their actual budget. So you can see that there
where
is,
it's being allocated.
If there is actual commitment there.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. They would also review access to federal benefits for people with mental health illness. Include mental health as an element of occupational safety under the Canada Labour Code and fund the hiring of up to 1,200 mental health counselors at post-secondary institutions.
Cool. Okay.
Which I think, okay, speaking of post-secondary, which I'm glad that they said this and that they addressed this because the rate of suicide in post-secondary institutions is just, it's insane.
It's frightening.
The fact that school can get you, it's frightening, yeah, school can get you that worked up, that stressed, that anxious, that low, to the point where you're willing to do that is criminal, and it absolutely needs to be addressed.
Yes.
Like the suicide rate at the University of Toronto is just insane. So I'm glad that they're addressing this. Now moving on to the Conservatives, So the Conservatives' plan includes asking the provinces to dedicate a significant portion, in quotes, significant portion. What that means, I'm not really sure.
No numbers
there. Of federal health funding to mental health care and encouraging employers to add mental health coverage to employee benefits by offering a 25% tax credit for the additional coverage for the first 3 years. So when it comes to the 25% tax credit for employee benefits, now this is very, in my opinion, kind of working around the issue, like in a skewed way, because they're not saying they're going to tackle it. They're saying, well, if your employer wants to tackle it, then we can help with that. But we're not going to tackle it. Like, that's what that's saying to me.
Yeah. And that, too, means that you already have to be employed with healthcare to be able to access this, which leaves major gaps that are existing of people who are unemployed, people who do not have benefits, or people who have not very robust benefits.
People who have minimum wage jobs, like their employer, they don't even have health coverage to begin with at those jobs.
Yeah.
So that excludes already just an insane amount of people. Probably the people that need it the most too.
Exactly.
And the last piece here is they would also provide $150 million over 3 years in grants to nonprofits and charities delivering mental health programming. $150 million over 3 years to nonprofits and charities, that is not very much. Like, it's a good portion of money in general. But when you think of $150 million across the entirety of Canada,
it's not a lot.
It's not a lot. And considering that you have to split that into 3 parts per year, it's also significantly less than $4.5 billion that the Liberals are offering. Yeah. So clearly their plan is providing much, much less than the Liberal plan. Now, on to this part right here. So in response to high suicide rates among Indigenous people specifically, the Conservatives would provide $1 billion over 5 years to boost funding for Indigenous mental health and drug treatment programs. Now, that is a very good thing. Now, the Liberals are committing a total investment of $2 billion over 5 years for cultural appropriate, trauma-informed supports for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people.
So double.
So while $1 billion is a very good thing, $2 billion is much better.
Yeah.
So again, their plan does fall short.
Yeah.
Now, moving on to the NDP would bring in mental health care for uninsured Canadians and develop a perinatal mental health strategy. They would also create a suicide prevention action plan backed by dedicated federal resources. The problem with this sentence is that it's so vague. Yeah. It has no numbers involved in it. Yeah. And while I do like the sentence of bring in mental health care for uninsured Canadians, like I like that sentence very much, there's no specifics as to how or how much or who qualifies or over how many years are you planning to deploy whatever amount of money that you have in your head that you won't tell us.
Where's the money coming from?
Where's it coming from? Like, where's the tangible action that we can actually hold on to? There's nothing to hold on to there. There's no substance there. Yeah. So that is really disappointing for me because I'll just be very honest, previous to this election, I was very pro NDP. So them falling short is extremely disappointing.
Totally. And another thing I want to say here is that you tried to look further into the NDP's platform just this article, and you couldn't find anything. Correct?
Yeah, well, not very much. That's the problem. But the thing is that with the NDP platform, and this is not me being biased, it's just very factual. I've been looking across their website, their platform, their report, and it's just not very detailed at all. They're making statements like we're gonna do like eliminating fossil fuels and taking on big polluters and more. And then I'm like, what's more? Yeah. What's the more? Like, give me specifics. This is your chance to tell us the more. Like, give me the details. That's what we want.
Yeah. So one thing I want to note here for everyone is that healthcare is under provincial jurisdiction. So that is why these are so short, and all these parties can really offer is to provide the funding to provinces. So what really matters here is how we vote in provincial elections.
When it comes to mental health issues,
totally.
Absolutely.
And I really would stress that local elections, including provincial, really are what's going to impact our lives the most. So I think it is really important for us to be always engaged in those level of elections.
Absolutely. We should, and in my opinion, we should be engaged in every level of elections.
Totally.
Federal, provincial, like in your city. You need to be involved in all of them because every single piece does affect you.
1000%. So that's kind of what I wanted to transition with, is with the NDP party being somewhat vague here. I want to caution people around that is when you start seeing parties making these huge, broad promises with no specific details, that can be a bit of a red flag where it may just be an empty promise. And that was something that we felt in 2015 with the Liberal Party. They made some really massive, exciting promises. The Conservative Party had been in power for a very long time, and Justin Trudeau got everyone very excited on Indigenous issues, on women's rights issues, on election reform as well. And there was a lot of empty promises there. And
Definitely.
I will say it's potentially not because these politicians don't want to do it, because I do believe these parties do want to do it, but there obviously are constraints in terms of how our systems work. So the next thing that we want to talk about is climate. And this has been a really challenging issue for me this election. It has made it really hard for me to make my own decision about who I want to vote for, because I really do feel like almost every party is falling short. And
they are, absolutely. Not almost, like every single party definitely falls short.
I would say the Green Party isn't falling short. Theirs is definitely the most robust, but the one problem obviously with the Green Party is, like, cast your vote, I would say, for however you want to cast your vote. There's obviously like strategic voting, but in the end, a democracy is about casting your vote for what you want. And if that means climate policy is the most important to you, then do consider the Green Party. I don't want to say to discount it because of strategic voting. That is just one way to vote, and it is something that I personally consider. So and the Green Party's climate promise is to reduce emissions by 60%, which of course is the most robust amongst all parties. The main things that I want to touch on amongst this is that kind of miscommunication that happened during the debate, which I will include a clip of, where Justin Trudeau is telling Jagmeet Singh that, oh, our platform was rated an A by scientists and yours like was rated a C or failed.
I think it is an F.
Yeah, or was rated an F. And there was like that big claim that happened during the debate.
Secondly, I do have a question for Mr. Singh. We need to talk about science. We need to talk about experts. We agree on that, you and I both. So how is it that the experts that have rated our plan on climate to be an A have rated your plan to be an F?
Experts,
I rate your track record an F, Mr. Trudeau. You've had 6 years.
You don't get to rate.
I rate.
Know.
Well,
Politicians,
not just me.
experts. Why did the experts give you an F on your climate?
Ms. Paul, with the greatest of respect, I think the 5 PhDs in our shadow cabinet who put together our green recovery policy would disagree with you, with the experts.
I want to address that. So what had happened there is that the NDP's climate plan is more robust than the Liberal Party's climate plan. But this rating was done by one economist that focuses on environmental issues, that typically does have a very strong standing in the community. But the way in which he measured these platforms has been highly criticized by the community. And that is because one of the major pillars that he used to measure the the different plans is the realisticness of achieving their plan. So can this party actually achieve it? And that's also why they rated the Conservative Party's plan higher than the NDP's party, which is very deceptive to voters, I will say.
That's like, that's so confusing.
Exactly.
Because like, how achievable is it? Well, if you set the shortest goals or the lowest goals that you can, then it becomes the most achievable.
Yeah, and then it looks like it's the best climate plan, which is not correct.
Sounds sketchy.
Yeah. So the NDP's plan is the most robust. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it here. Again, I'm going to link to another podcast that you can watch that's going to dive deeper into this, because obviously we've covered a lot of issues here and the podcast is getting a little long. Yeah. So I'm going to send people over to another podcast I like, which is called The Green Majority, that covers environmental issues very, very well. The next problem I'm having in terms of climate policy is what is happening in BC and Fairy Creek right now. So if you haven't heard of Fairy Creek, it is the old growth forest that is being logged, and there are a lot of protesters. It is predominantly Indigenous led, who have been creating a blockade, which has been attacked heavily by the RCMP. People recently were hospitalized, and
it's like they're only a few arrests away from it becoming like one of the biggest and most like arrests made protests in history.
What is most upsetting to me is that in BC there is an NDP government, and they ran promising to not allow logging in old growth forests. They have failed to meet that commitment, and they've failed to address the issues surrounding the RCMP. And one thing I found very upsetting during the federal leaders debate was that Jagmeet Singh was asked a question about Fairy Creek, about there being an NDP government there, and he kind of danced around the topic. He didn't talk about old growth logging.
No, he blamed the RCMP for the mistreatment of human beings, but he didn't address the actual root issue, which is the fact that they promised not to allow old growth logging, and then they did it anyway.
My next question is to you, Mr. Singh. Federal forces, including the RCMP and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, have been used throughout Canada's history to prevent First Nations from exercising their treaty rights to fish and to hunt and to defend land and water. This is happening right now on both coasts, including under the NDP party in British Columbia with regards to fishing and logging. So my question would be to you, as Prime Minister, what would you do to ensure Indigenous rights and title are finally respected in this country?
I really appreciate the question. First of all, we need to respect Indigenous treaty land and rights. That's a fundamental step towards walking the path of reconciliation in a real meaningful way. But you mentioned the RCMP, and I got to talk about the really sad reality that there's been violence, heavy-handed violence, against Indigenous communities, against peaceful protesters. And I have long called for reform of policing. When I was in the provincial level, I fought against carting. I've continued to use every platform I have to say, we've got to stop the use of force. We've got to overview it. We've got to change the RCMP's mandate. And that's something we can do at the federal level. That's something that Mr. Trudeau said he would do and yet has yet to do. And it's something I'm committed to making sure happens.
That was overall very upsetting to me. I am the most disappointed in the NDP party around climate action. While their platform it does have very strong promises, the fact that there isn't very many specifics is concerning to me. And another thing I want to note is Jagmeet Singh, especially in the last election, was very strongly in opposition to the TMX pipeline, which the Liberal Party has invested into, claiming that that is going to fund our transition. I will say that money has already been invested to that, and what Jagmeet says is since money has already been put into it, it doesn't make sense to cancel the pipeline. So what I want to say on that, and what is my opinion, is the future is not oil.
Certainly not.
It doesn't make sense to me for us to continue to be investing in oil if we do not start to make investments into green technology, into green energy sources. Then we are going to fall behind. Right now, Canada is a leader in energy producing, which is predominantly in oil. But in the next coming years, we are going to be forced to change. And if we are not at the front of that change, Canada as a country is going to be left behind. So that is how I feel there. That's an opinion. Obviously, money has already been put into that. Of course, the oil industry is one of the biggest sources of revenue for the Canadian government. That funds, those are distributed amongst all of the provinces. So I want to acknowledge that. And I do want to say that something I think is important is bringing those green jobs into Alberta, where those oil jobs are going to be lost, because I do recognize that it is a scary time for Albertans. Losing their jobs, losing their sources of revenue, their livelihoods is a really scary thing. So while there can be a lot of blame on Albertans for turning to the right, I can understand where those feelings come from, but I think the transition needs to be very holistic. It needs to be calming to people who are going to be like at the forefront of losing their jobs. And yeah, that's kind of how I feel there.
Yeah. And I completely agree with that. And also, it's important to note the intersection of climate issues with Indigenous issues. Like, yes, there is reconciliation issues, which both the NDP, the Liberals, and the Conservatives, and the Green Party brought up. They all seem to be pretty much on the same page with reconciliations, though the approaches slightly differ. But how much can they actually deliver? It's like, I don't really have high hopes. They've always, like, every single party has always treated the Indigenous peoples wrongly, criminally, and discriminatorily. Like, I don't know how there can even be reconciliation with these parties, to be honest with you. And the thing is that, like I mentioned, climate action directly affects the Indigenous population the most, more than the average Canadian, because they do rely on nature itself for their well-being, more so than the average Canadian does. So I remember listening to a speech from an Indigenous leader that was talking about how climate change is directly affecting their livelihood. If there's no salmon to eat, how will they feed their children? If there's no moose to hunt, how will they feed their children? Like, all of these issues are intersectional. They intertwine. It's not isolated. So we really not only need to be considering how we vote, but also after we vote, how we take action on these important issues. Yeah. So that's where I want to leave you guys. Please, like, regardless of our biases, do vote however it is that you want to vote, however it is that these issues speak to you the most. That's what you should do. But regardless of how you vote, we just encourage that you do.
Yeah. The last thing I want to touch on is make sure that you're registered to vote. I'm going to include a link where you can plan your voting process in the show notes down below. So make sure you're registered, watch for your voter information card in the mail, make a plan to vote, and bring your ID when you go to vote.
Yes, and that's everything. With all that being said, you guys, please make sure that you do like, comment, and subscribe, because it really helps out our channel every single week. And do leave in the comments what your thoughts are, any issues that you want to bring up that are important to you, anything that you disagree when it comes to what we stated. We would love to hear down below in the comments, so please let us know. With all that being said, we will see you in the next pod.
Peace.